The only woman on Tennessee's death row is asking the courts to reconsider.
It's harder to hurt somebody when they're talking to you. That's Christa Pike's own voice, captured on an actual police interrogation tape, calmly explaining why she wouldn't let a 19-year-old girl stop begging for her life. Colleen Slemmer trusted the people who led her into those woods that night. They were classmates, people she'd shared breakfast with that same morning. By sunrise, she was dead, and the person responsible wasn't hiding, wasn't running, wasn't afraid. She was sitting in the cafeteria, showing off proof of what she'd done like it was something to be proud of. Investigators who found the scene initially thought they were looking at a ritual killing, some kind of cult signature carved into the evidence. They were wrong. There was no cult, no ritual, no larger meaning. Just a teenage girl who decided another teenage girl's life belonged to her, and 30 minutes to an hour to prove it. More than 3 decades later, Tennessee is finally set to carry out the sentence for what happened that night. But a legal battle just weeks old, triggered by a catastrophic failure inside the state's own execution chamber, could still change how, or even if, that happens. This is the story of Christa Pike, the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States, and the case that could determine whether Tennessee's execution system survives its next attempt. Warning: before we go further, this case involves violence and disturbing details some viewers may find difficult to watch. Please take care of yourself and step away if you need to. Welcome back to the Crime Vault, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Here are the facts. On January 12, 1995, 3 teenagers lured a fellow student into a wooded area near the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus in Knoxville. Her name was Colleen Slemmer. She was 19 years old. She didn't survive the night. The person who orchestrated her death was Christa Pike, 18 at the time. A year later, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The court sentenced her to death, making her, at 20 years old, the youngest woman sentenced to death in the modern history of the United States. She has been on death row ever since. 2 other teenagers were involved that night. One was convicted alongside her and received a life sentence, since he was still a minor. The other cooperated with investigators and received probation instead of prison time. Now, more than 30 years later, Tennessee has a date on the calendar. If it holds, Christa Pike will become the first woman executed in this state in roughly 200 years. Locally, this case became known simply as the Job Corps murder, a name that has followed it through 3 decades of appeals, hearings, and now, a final legal fight. What follows is how it happened, in the order it actually unfolded. Colleen Slemmer was born on September 20th, 1975, and grew up in Orange Park, Florida, with her mother, her stepfather, and a younger sister. By 1994, college wasn't a realistic option for her family financially, so Colleen looked at a different path: the Job Corps, a federally funded vocational program that trained young adults for skilled work. She wanted to study computers. The Job Corps center closest to home, in Jacksonville, didn't offer that program. The one in Knoxville, Tennessee did, so she packed up and moved 800 miles from home to chase it, leaving behind everyone and everything familiar to her. People who knew her described her consistently: quiet, trusting, not someone who looked for conflict. She wasn't the type to escalate an argument, and by most accounts, she avoided confrontation whenever she could, even when it meant staying silent rather than standing up for herself. Her mother later told reporters that Colleen had a soft spot for helping children with disabilities, something she had cared about since she was 8 years old. Colleen wasn't chasing anything dramatic. She wanted a desk job, a steady paycheck, and the kind of stability her family hadn't always had growing up. Computer training felt like a realistic way to get there, not a long shot, just a plan built one semester at a time. By January of 1995, Colleen had been at the Knoxville Job Corps for about 3 months. She was still new, still finding her footing in a place far from home, surrounded by people she didn't know well yet. She had no way of knowing that one of her classmates had already decided she was a threat, or that the decision had nothing to do with anything she had actually done. Here are the facts. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand where it happened. Job Corps was created in the 1960s to give young people a second chance. Free vocational training, housing, meals, and a small stipend, in exchange for working toward a GED or a trade skill. The Knoxville Center pulled students from all over the country. Kids who had dropped out of school, kids from unstable homes, kids with minor records. On paper, it looked like a boarding school. Uniforms, schedules, supervision during the day. The intentions behind the program were good. The execution was more complicated. Hundreds of teenagers, many carrying real trauma and unresolved behavioral issues, were housed together in close quarters, with limited supervision once classes ended for the day. For a program meant to stabilize young people, the environment itself could be unpredictable. For some students, that structure was exactly what they needed. For others, it became something closer to a pressure cooker, where old conflicts didn't disappear once they arrived. They simply found a new setting to play out in, away from the eyes of the people meant to be watching. By January of 1995, that setting had become home to two teenagers whose paths were about to cross in a way neither of them could have predicted. Christa Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia. Her childhood, according to court records filed by her own defense team, was defined by instability from the very beginning. She was exposed to alcohol before birth, a documented factor tied to lasting effects on impulse control and emotional regulation. She was raised primarily by her grandmother, and when her grandmother died, Pike was 12 years old. She attempted suicide shortly after, with little support in the aftermath, and by her early teens, she had already cycled through several unstable living situations. Court filings also document a history of abuse throughout her childhood, and separately, a stranger's assault against her at 17, an incident she reported to authorities and which was medically documented at the time. Her defense team would later argue that this pattern of untreated trauma shaped nearly everything that followed. At trial, a psychiatrist named Dr. Eric Engum evaluated her directly. His findings were specific. Pike had an IQ of 111, showed no evidence of brain damage, and was legally sane. But he also diagnosed her with a severe borderline personality disorder, a condition marked by intense, unstable relationships, a fragile sense of identity, and serious difficulty regulating emotion under stress. It's a diagnosis that would follow her case through every appeal filed in the decades since. By the time she arrived at the Knoxville Job Corps, Pike had already dropped out of high school and picked up a minor juvenile record. Other students described her as someone who commanded attention the moment she entered a room, and who didn't back down once a confrontation started. She met a younger student there, 17-year-old Tatterall Shipp, and the two began dating. Shipp had a documented interest in occult imagery, and reportedly kept objects tied to that interest in his dorm room, a detail that would later send investigators down the wrong path, once similar imagery turned up at the crime scene. A third student, 18-year-old Shadola Peterson, rounded out their small, insular group. The three of them became known around the dormitories as a unit, rarely seen apart. None of this explains what came next. It provides context for it. The difference between a reason and an excuse is one this case has forced courts to sit with for 30 years, through appeal after appeal that has raised her mental health and upbringing without ever overturning the verdict itself. What makes Pike's case unusual isn't the trauma in her background. Plenty of defendants carry similar histories. What set her apart, according to the psychiatric evaluation itself, was that none of it impaired her ability to understand right from wrong. She knew exactly what she was doing. The only open question has been why she chose to do it anyway. The conflict had a simple, almost mundane origin. Pike became convinced that Colleen Slemmer was pursuing her boyfriend. Other students who knew Colleen would later testify that this wasn't true, that she actively avoided Shipp and had no real interest in him. But Pike had made up her mind, and by January, the tension between them had been building for weeks. largely one-sided, with Colleen mostly staying out of her way. On January 11, 1995, the day before the murder, a fellow Job Corps student named Kim Iloilo would later testify that Pike had already told her, directly, that she intended to kill Colleen. This wasn't panic. It was a decision made a full day in advance, stated plainly to someone else. The next evening, Pike approached Colleen with a completely different tone, calm, friendly, almost apologetic. She said she wanted to put the tension behind them and invited Colleen to join her and two others for a walk off campus, framed as a peace offering. Colleen agreed. She had no reason to think it was anything other than what it appeared to be. That sequence, a threat made a day in advance followed by a calculated approach the next evening, became one of the prosecution's central arguments at trial. Most coverage of this case skips a detail like Kim Iloilo's testimony entirely, even though it's one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the whole case. Digging up details like that is exactly what keeps this channel worth coming back to. The four of them left the Job Corps Center that evening and walked off campus, heading toward the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus, eventually reaching a secluded area near Tyson Park. The temperature had dropped well below freezing by the time they got there. Once they were away from campus and out of sight of anyone who might intervene, the group turned on Colleen. What followed was a sustained assault lasting somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, according to Pike's own later confession. Colleen attempted to escape at least once during the attack and was pulled back before she could get away. Official records list the cause of death as blunt force trauma. She did not survive. During the assault, a symbol was carved into her, a pentagram tied to Ship's occult interests. It became the piece of evidence that initially sent investigators down the wrong path, toward a theory involving ritual or cult violence. That theory turned out to be completely wrong. What happened in those woods wasn't ritualistic, and it wasn't random. It was deliberate, carried out by three people who knew exactly who they were targeting. Shadola Peterson served as lookout during the attack, positioned at the edge of the clearing, watching for anyone who might interrupt them or call for help. No one did. When it was over, the three of them left the scene and walked back to the Job Corps Center, slipping into their dormitories as though nothing had happened. No attempt was made to hide the fact that Colleen was gone. No alibi was prepared. It was, by nearly every account that followed, a strikingly careless way to end a life someone had spent a full day planning to take. Colleen's body was discovered the next day by a university grounds employee working near the campus. At the Job Corps Center that same morning, she had already been marked absent from attendance, a routine notation that gave no indication of what had actually happened overnight. What broke the case open wasn't forensic technology, it was Pike herself. Within roughly a day of the murder, she was showing a physical item taken from the crime scene to other students in the cafeteria, describing the attack in detail. She wasn't hiding what she had done. By multiple accounts, she seemed to want people to know, treating the encounter almost as something to boast about rather than conceal. That behavior didn't stay contained to one conversation. Word spread quickly through the dormitories, and a student who had heard about it eventually contacted the Knoxville Police Department. Within about 36 hours of the murder, detectives had a name attached to the case. They brought Pike in for questioning on January 14th, and what happened next surprised the investigators in the room. Rather than asking for a lawyer or denying involvement, she waived her Miranda rights without hesitation, sat down, and gave a full, composed confession on tape. She walked detectives through the sequence of events herself, largely without prompting, describing each stage of the attack in the same steady tone she used to describe everything else. Physical evidence backed up what she said. Investigators recovered blood-stained clothing and items connected to the attack from the dormitories, along with the object Pike had shown to classmates the day before. Search warrants executed at the Job Corps Center in the days that followed turned up additional evidence, tying all three teenagers directly to the scene. Detectives noted something else during the interrogation. Throughout her confession, Pike never once asked about Colleen's condition, never asked whether she had survived, and showed almost no concern beyond narrating her own account of events, a level of detachment that stood out even to detectives accustomed to hardened suspects. Investigators would later point to this as one of the more unusual aspects of the case, a confession that read less like a moment of reckoning and more like a factual report. All three teenagers, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson, were arrested and formally charged within days. By the time the case moved toward the courtroom, there was a recorded confession, corroborating physical evidence, and multiple witnesses. Very little was left for either side to genuinely dispute about what had actually taken place that night. Christa Pike's trial began in March 1996. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. They had a taped confession, physical evidence that matched it in nearly every detail, and effectively no real dispute left over what had happened that night. Their focus wasn't on proving the crime, it was on proving intent, and on convincing the jury that the crime warranted the harshest sentence available under Tennessee law. The defense didn't contest the facts of the crime itself. Instead, they focused entirely on Pike's mental state, presenting evidence of her documented childhood and arguing that it had fundamentally impaired her judgment and her capacity to fully understand the weight of her actions. Dr. Engham's diagnosis of borderline personality disorder became central to this argument, alongside broader testimony about the effects of her upbringing on her decision-making. A second defense witness testified that group dynamics among the three teenagers likely escalated what had originally been intended as an act of intimidation into something far more severe. The defense argued, in essence, that a jury shouldn't sentence someone to death for a crime shaped so heavily by circumstances she never chose. The jury wasn't persuaded. They deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict on March 22, 1996, convicting Pike of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On March 30th, the court handed down its sentence: death, plus 25 years for the conspiracy charge. In the courtroom, as the sentence was read aloud, Pike reportedly broke down, sobbing and calling out for her mother, a moment that stood in stark contrast to the composure she had shown earlier in the case. At 20 years old, she became the youngest woman in the modern era to receive a death sentence anywhere in the United States. Her co-defendants received very different outcomes. Tatterall Shipp, 17 at the time of the murder, was legally ineligible for the death penalty as a juvenile under state law. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, plus 25 additional years for his role in the crime. Shadola Peterson, who had served only as lookout and cooperated fully with investigators from the beginning, pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She received probation and never spent a day in prison. That disparity, one death sentence, one life sentence, and one probation for three people involved in the same crime, has remained a central argument in Pike's legal appeals ever since. In later filings, her attorneys have pointed out that when Pike was originally sentenced, the court compared her case to several similar ones, and that most of those other defendants are no longer even eligible for execution under legal standards that have shifted significantly in the decades since. Most coverage of this case ends right here, at the verdict, as though the story was already finished. It wasn't. What came next, on death row and in the courts, stretched across 3 more decades and is still unfolding today. Subscribing means you'll be here for the rest of it. A death sentence is rarely the end of a case. It's usually the start of a decades-long appeals process. For Christa Pike, those decades on death row were not quiet. In August 2001, Pike attacked a fellow inmate named Patricia Jones inside the prison, attempting to strangle her with a shoelace. Correctional officers intervened before Jones was killed. Pike was later convicted of attempted first-degree murder for the assault in 2004, adding significant additional time to a sentence that was already death, and confirming to prison officials that her incarceration would require a level of vigilance most inmates never warrant. Roughly a decade later, in 2012, Pike was connected to a plan to escape from the Tennessee prison for women. 2 people were charged in connection with the plot: Justin Heflin, a correctional officer who worked directly in her housing unit, and Donald Kohut, a man from New Jersey who had built a relationship with Pike through more than a year of letters and prison visits, eventually making a nearly 1,700-mile round trip on a regular basis just to see her in person. Investigators uncovered the plan through internal reporting before it could be carried out. Heflin was fired from his position and criminally charged. Kohout was arrested and later sentenced to 7 years in prison. Pike herself was never formally charged in connection with the plot, since investigators were ultimately unable to determine the full extent of her personal involvement, even though the plan had clearly centered around her from the start. In the years following that incident, prison officials placed Pike under extreme isolation, citing the escape attempt and her prior assault on Jones as justification. Her legal team eventually filed a lawsuit arguing that the extent of that isolation amounted to unconstitutional treatment. The state settled the case in late 2024, granting her somewhat more time outside her cell, a resolution that arrived just as a far larger legal fight over whether her execution would actually proceed was about to begin. One more development from this period rarely appears in coverage of this case. Roughly a year after the murder, Colleen's mother, May Martinez, discovered that her daughter had been buried without a piece of her remains, which the state had retained as evidence. Martinez was outraged by the discovery, and she spent years afterward publicly campaigning for its return, so that her daughter could finally be laid to rest whole. It became for her a second and separate fight running quietly alongside the appeals process, one that had nothing to do with the courtroom at all, but that consumed just as much of her life. On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set Pike's execution date, September 30th, 2026. That same month, Tatterall Shipp had his first parole hearing in nearly 30 years of incarceration. It was denied, with the board citing the severity of the crime. His case won't be reviewed again until 2031. For Pike, the countdown triggered a final wave of legal action. Her attorneys have continued to petition the governor directly for clemency, asking that her sentence be commuted to life in prison, arguing that executing someone for a crime committed at 18 conflicts with a broader legal shift in how courts weigh youth and culpability. That argument isn't without precedent. In a 2019 appellate opinion, one federal judge wrote separately to note that Pike's age at the time of the crime placed her case close to the line courts have used to exempt younger offenders from execution altogether, even while agreeing that existing precedent didn't yet require that outcome in her case. The clemency effort hasn't succeeded so far, so in January 2026, her attorneys filed a lawsuit challenging the state's execution method itself, a single drug protocol using pentobarbital. The suit cites a documented blood condition that her legal team argues could cause severe complications during the procedure, along with other documented medical and psychiatric conditions. It also raises a religious rights argument. Pike is a practicing Buddhist, and her attorneys say the state's restrictions on contact with a spiritual advisor during her final hours conflict with her sincerely held beliefs. Then, in May 2026, something happened that changed the entire conversation around her case. Tennessee attempted to execute a different death row inmate, Tony Carruthers, using the same lethal injection protocol Pike is now challenging. The execution team spent more than an hour unable to establish a required backup line. The attempt was called off, and the governor granted Carruthers a 1-year reprieve. That same month, Pike's case was formally transferred to the Tennessee Supreme Court directly, under a newly amended rule requiring this kind of litigation to be heard there rather than in a lower court. Pike's attorneys moved quickly. In June 2026, just weeks before this video, they filed a new motion citing the Carruthers failure directly, arguing the state cannot constitutionally carry out her execution given her own documented conditions. The state disputes this, maintaining its protocol is sound, and that Carruthers was an isolated failure. There is also a separate wrinkle. Because Pike's crime occurred before 1999, state law lets her choose electrocution instead. Her attorneys argue that choosing between two methods she considers unconstitutional isn't a meaningful choice. The Tennessee Supreme Court is still weighing the case. As of now, the date officially stands, and whether it holds is genuinely still an open question. Strip away the appeals, the protocols, and the legal filings, and what's left is simple. A 19-year-old girl who moved to Tennessee looking for a fresh start never got the chance to use it. Colleen Slemmer isn't a footnote in someone else's legal battle. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, a person who spent her childhood looking out for kids who needed it. 3 decades later, her mother is still showing up, to parole hearings, to court filings, to every new development in a case that refuses to close. Whether Christa Pike is executed on September 30th, or whether this latest legal challenge changes that outcome, is something the courts will decide in the months ahead. What isn't in dispute is what happened in those woods in January of 1995, or the life it took from a family that has waited 3 decades for this to be over. The legal questions may still be unresolved. The facts of that night never were. We'll be following this case as it develops, and when there's a resolution, we'll be among the first to cover it. If you want to know how it ends, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it.